Hi, I'm Corey Driver, and this is Moving Forward. So now we're in the Gospel of Mark, and we have the story of John coming to start the baptismal ministry, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus the Messiah. So right away, there's a ton of movement, and movement is going to characterize this gospel as we move forward. And so you have John appearing and going into the wilderness. You have all of Judea and Jerusalem going out to see what John's doing. And then you have this call to make straight some pathways. And then finally, John will talk about Jesus as the one who is to come, right? And so there's all this movement right away. And it kind of surrounds this borrowing of a passage from Isaiah. It says, "In the wilderness, prepare the ways of the Lord. In the desert, make straight a highway for God. Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low. The rough ground shall be made level, and the rugged places a plain." That's Isaiah 43-4. We only get a snippet of that here in the Gospel according to Mark. But John is proclaiming that a way should be made. Now, let's think back a little bit, and then we'll come back to Mark and John. But let's think back a little bit to the original context of Isaiah. This is being preached to the refugees, those who have gone into exile, who have been there for decades and decades, and God is welcoming them back. Now, we talk about making a highway for God, and certainly we're thinking about that in terms of John preparing the way for Jesus. But this highway for God in Isaiah, why does it need to be level? Why do mountains need to be lowered? Why do low places need to be raised? And why does God need a path at all? Isn't God like the designer and creator of the universe? Who needs a path? Well, people do. Folks who have been in exile, who have grown up, children who have been born in exile and don't even know the homeland, need a way back. And so God makes a shortcut across a desert to bring back the people whom God has redeemed from all their suffering, to say, come on back, come to me. I want you to be with me. And so it's this highway for God, to be sure, but it's a highway that God uses to bring God's people back home, to a place of hope and safety. So hundreds of years later, Jesus' relative John stands on the edge of that same wilderness. And all of Judea and Jerusalem goes out to him. God's people are once again moving to the cusp of the desert to see what it is that God might be doing. And when they get there, John is saying, look, I'm not the Messiah. There's another one coming. He is more worthy than I. And once more, God is moving across and through the wilderness place. Though this time, it is not to bring people back from exile, but in a figurative way, for God to go in a little bit of exile, God's self, in the person of Jesus, to come and once again save God's people, not from invading armies, not from exile, but this time from sin and death. So Jesus moves into an environment in order to make a way through the wasteland of sin and death for God's people to be redeemed and once again reunited with God's self. That's what we have to see here in the first couple verses of the Gospel according to Mark, is that God is doing what God has always done, making a way for God's people, going through that way first. The highway is for God in Isaiah, after all, in order to bring people back. And so that's what Jesus does here too, ultimately, is to go first and then carry God's people back to God's self. So this is the introduction through the Gospel according to Mark. This is John's business to say, look, I'm calling all of us to make a pathway for God, because ultimately God is going to make a pathway for God's self to rescue us. And we get to participate in that effort. And that is very good news at the beginning of Mark.